What's going on here? Why are you ignoring our daughter when she's in this state? Please, take her to the hospital. When I returned from work, my 1-year-old daughter was crying uncontrollably. Yet my husband was watching TV, laughing at comedy shows. Leave her be. It's not the first time she's thrown a tantrum. She'll tire herself out and quiet down eventually. Indeed, my daughter, whom I was now holding, seemed to be tiring out, her intense crying subsiding. But her complexion was poor, and her lips were turning blue from lack of blood flow. I quickly called for an ambulance. At the hospital where we were transported, the doctor's examination revealed a shocking truth. My husband had broken his promise to me and had been secretly continuing something behind my back. When I confronted my husband, who arrived late to the hospital, he turned red with anger and lashed out. Why is everyone ganging up on me and making me the bad guy? Is that so much fun for you? You told me to watch her, so that's all I did. You never said to comfort her when she cries or take her to the hospital if something seemed wrong. My husband fled from the hospital, claiming he was being unfairly vilified. Despite putting our daughter's life at risk, he showed no remorse. I made up my mind to seek revenge. I'm Hazel. I met my husband through local volunteer work. While I participated individually, he was there as part of his company's regular volunteer program. He could interact with anyone without discrimination, and he was especially kind to elderly people and small children. I was drawn to that side of him. After meeting several times through volunteer activities, we began dating, and following his passionate proposal, we got married. I left my hometown for college and found work without returning. Since my life was centered in the city, we chose to live closer to the urban area than my hometown after marriage. This worked well for my husband's commute too, and we enjoyed our newlywed life in good spirits. Though being closer to my in-laws than my own parents was a slight concern, I got along well with both of them. My father-in-law particularly impressed me by continuing the swimming he had started in his youth even after turning 60. Since I too had been passionate about swimming as a child, I found we had much to talk about. Soon after marriage, I became pregnant. Our daughter was born a year and a half after our wedding, and we were happy with our growing family. During my first childbirth, both sets of parents and my husband rushed to be there, making me feel truly cherished. I thought about how lucky our daughter was to have so many people eagerly awaiting her arrival. I imagined someday telling her about this moment when she grew up. However, our happiness didn't last long. It came to light that my husband had lied about both his savings and annual income before marriage. Regarding the savings, I decided to overlook his attempt to appear more financially stable, thinking we could build our savings together. But I wished he had been honest about his income. When we were both working before my maternity leave, I hadn't paid much attention to his earnings. But when I took time off for childcare, my reduced income began to gradually affect our lifestyle. If it had just been the two of us, we might have managed. But with another family member, we discovered his low income wasn't nearly enough to support us. Children become more expensive as they grow. Considering this, I knew I couldn't remain idle, so I returned to work when our daughter turned 1. I actually wanted to return sooner, but finding childcare took 6 months. I struggled daily with guilt about leaving our daughter at daycare to work. I had wanted to be a stay-at-home mom until she entered middle school because I didn't want her to experience the same loneliness I had. My own mother worked, and from my earliest memories, I was always at my grandparents' house or daycare during the day. Though I felt lonely, I never resented my mother. She would always come to see me when she returned home and spend time with me no matter how tired she was. My father was the same. I could feel how much both my parents loved me. Telling myself that if my mother could do it, so could I pushed forward. No matter how tired I was or how late I worked, I prioritized time with my daughter and showered her with affection. My husband's department didn't seem as busy. He had no overtime or weekend work and enjoyed considerable flexibility. He could even work from home, and after I returned to work, he increased his remote working hours. I increasingly relied on him for daycare pickup and drop-off, and he willingly participated in childcare without complaint. I felt reassured that I had married someone who genuinely enjoyed helping others. He even continued volunteering on weekends occasionally. I looked forward to resuming local volunteer work myself once our daughter was a bit older. Then one day, when I returned from work and was changing our daughter's clothes, I noticed a bump on her head. It hadn't been there when I dressed her that morning, so something must have happened while I was away. When I asked my husband about it, he said she had hit her head on the table leg. From the size of the bump, she must have cried quite a bit from pain. Moreover, with head injuries, you can't always tell the severity just by looking, so I naturally assumed he had taken her to the hospital. However, he laughed and said, "Going to the hospital for just bumping her head? That's overdramatic." I lost my composure and argued back. Even adults are told to get thorough examinations for head injuries, so why are you, an amateur, making that judgment? He then turned the tables, becoming angry that I was complaining when he had been watching her while working from home. If that's how you feel, why don't you stop working overtime and come home for your daughter? Actually, as a mother, shouldn't you have priorities more important than earning money? Though I wanted to snap back, "Look who's talking." I held my tongue. It would only escalate the argument. Besides, the real problem was that if he earned more, this wouldn't be an issue. If he worked at a company without overtime, he could take on a part-time job in the evening or switch to a better-paying company. We were just at the beginning of child rearing. With such a long road ahead, could we really continue like this? I began to worry about my husband's overly laid-back attitude. After this incident, I started avoiding leaving our daughter in his care and tried to handle her care myself whenever possible. My company was generally understanding about women with children. They quietly allowed me to step out temporarily when needed. However, I couldn't keep saying, "I can't work overtime," too often. I worked hard to balance my job and childcare while coordinating with the daycare center. After about 2 months of this routine, I had to attend a work-related funeral that I couldn't miss. An important client had passed away, and I needed to pay my respects. It was too sudden to arrange holiday childcare, so I had no choice but to leave our daughter with my husband. After the previous head-bumping incident, we had taken her to the hospital together the next day for an explanation of her symptoms. Though it turned out to be less serious than I had worried, the examining doctor had rather sternly warned us that while nothing serious happened this time, that might not always be the case, and we should never take our eyes off her. My husband seemed to have reflected deeply on this. When I asked if I could trust him this time, he assured me he would never make the same mistake twice. I believed his words and left our daughter in his care. However, unable to shake my worry, I contacted him after reaching the station and again before entering the funeral home to check on our daughter. Though I worried he might get angry at my persistence, I couldn't help myself. But this time, he responded kindly to my repeated calls, gently telling me I was being a worrywart. I told myself that he must be growing as a father and that everything would be fine, then entered the funeral home. After the funeral, still concerned about our daughter, I headed straight home. A colleague offered to drive me, which I gratefully accepted since it would be faster than taking the train. After being dropped off and watching the car drive away, I entered the house. I heard our daughter crying from the living room. Rushing there, I found her lying on her back, crying intensely. Yet my husband wasn't even trying to comfort her, completely absorbed in the TV and occasionally laughing. "Hey, what are you doing?" I shouted, turning off the TV my husband was watching. He got slightly angry, saying I'd interrupted at a good part, and grabbed the remote from my hand to turn the TV back on. What's more, apparently annoyed by my shouting, he turned up the volume. This gradually drowned out our daughter's crying. I quickly realized the TV volume wasn't the only issue. Our daughter's complexion was worsening, and she seemed to be having trouble breathing. "Please, get the car out right now," I pleaded. Though I could drive myself, I wasn't confident in my driving skills after not having driven for so long. We had kept the car despite my husband's salary being insufficient for a family of 3 precisely for emergencies involving our daughter. "She hasn't hit her head today, it's just fussing." "Just leave her be," he said. "How can you say, leave her be, looking at her face? Just drive us to the hospital, that's all I'm asking." "Fine, fine. But let me finish this good part first." Our daughter's lips had lost all color. Her labored breathing seemed to be getting weaker and weaker. Deciding I couldn't wait for my husband to act, I called an ambulance. I gathered only the essentials and rode in the ambulance when it arrived. I requested they take us to the pediatric clinic where our daughter was a regular patient. However, being evening on a holiday and the clinic not being set up for emergencies, we had to search for another hospital. The ambulance wouldn't depart until a destination was confirmed. After being turned away by 2 hospitals, we finally got accepted by a general hospital in the neighboring city. Throughout all this, my husband remained engrossed in TV, showing no interest in our situation. I just told him I'd contact him once we reached the hospital, and left with our daughter. At the hospital, the on-duty doctor handled everything from examination to treatment. I had been worried, having preconceptions about on-duty doctors being like part-timers, but this doctor provided thorough examination and quick treatment. The doctor prefaced by saying it had been a close call if we'd waited any longer, but that treatment was complete and we could rest easy now. Upon hearing those words, I felt my knees go weak with relief. A nurse approached me, saying the doctor had an explanation to give. They also decided to keep our daughter overnight for observation. The doctor started with the conclusion: our daughter had accidentally ingested an e-cigarette. Though it was a small amount, it was too much for a 1-year-old's body to handle, causing her condition to deteriorate rapidly. When the doctor asked if anyone living with us smoked, I instinctively shook my head. My husband had promised to quit smoking when we learned I was pregnant. Since then, I hadn't seen him smoke once. There hadn't been any tobacco smelled either, so I believed he had kept his promise to quit. But the reality was different. He had been secretly smoking where I wouldn't notice. Though I had initially shaken my head, I corrected myself, saying there was a possibility my husband was smoking without my knowledge. Just then, my husband slouched into the hospital. The moment I saw him, I couldn't help but confront him. "Why did you keep secretly smoking? Even if you had to hide it from me, at least don't smoke in front of our daughter." "Ha! What's with you suddenly? It's fine now, isn't it? The pregnancy period is over." That wasn't the point. He further dismissed our daughter's condition, saying things like, "Since everything turned out fine, it's no big deal, right?" in a detached manner. At this point, the doctor, who had been silent until now, raised his voice. "I won't question why you hide smoking from your wife. But children are curious about everything and tend to put things in their mouths. As a father, it's common sense to keep things that children might swallow out of their reach." The doctor further scolded my husband, asking if he couldn't even imagine what would happen to a 1-year-old ingesting something known to be harmful even to adults. "Why do I have to be blamed this much? This is ridiculous." Whether embarrassed at being scolded by the doctor or hurt in his pride, my husband's face turned red with anger. Then he ran away from the scene. Honestly, we didn't need him there anyway. And perhaps our daughter could sleep more peacefully without the presence of a father who hadn't helped her when she was suffering. I felt that my top priority right now wasn't chasing after my fleeing husband, but staying by the side of my daughter who had endured such pain in her tiny body. The next day, when the pediatrician examined her, they recommended keeping her in the hospital a bit longer for observation. While the night duty doctor had said she could be discharged, they thought it better to keep her under complete medical supervision given that I worked during the day. I went home briefly to prepare for her hospital stay and decided I couldn't work that day, so I called in to take the day off. When I got home, there was no sign my husband had returned. If he had just come home sulking, there might have been room for reconciliation. But to not even feel remorse for what he did to our daughter, to pretend nothing happened, and then to run away pouting when called out, was this how an adult behaves? His actions were so immature, like a middle school student. While our daughter's complete recovery came first, I strongly felt that after that, I wanted to divorce him. But 3 days passed, and he didn't return. I searched everywhere I could think of, but his whereabouts were completely unknown. By the 5th day, feeling I couldn't let this continue, I contacted my in-laws. Of course, I told them everything that had led to this situation. After hearing from me, my in-laws managed to track down that he was at least going to work, and they ambushed him at his workplace. Actually, on the day my husband hadn't come home, I had called his company once. But at that time, they said he hadn't come in. Whether my husband had told them to say that to me or if he really hadn't gone to work, I don't know, but I was relieved at least to know he was safe. Though he was failing as an adult, husband, and father, I would have felt awful if he had died somewhere. Even though his actions were problematic, I didn't feel good about our fight ending this way, and I thought it cowardly of him to disappear without even apologizing for what he did to our daughter. When my husband noticed his parents lying in wait, he apparently tried to run away at full speed. However, he couldn't escape from my mother-in-law, who had been a track and field athlete in her student days. Furthermore, my father-in-law caught and restrained him. Though my husband struggled desperately, being completely opposite to his athletic parents and thoroughly bookish, he was no match for his father. His suit was in tatters when his parents caught and brought him back. Additionally, since I had already reported everything about his treatment of our daughter to my in-laws, they gave him a thorough dressing down about that as well. My husband was already in a state of complete defeat, totally deflated. Apparently, after fleeing from the hospital that day, he had gone straight to a hotel without stopping at home once. He had bought changes of clothes there too. Though I wanted to demand where he got the money for that, right now the issue wasn't about money but about how he treated our daughter. Weren't you worried about our daughter at all? Even if you didn't want to see me, didn't you think about coming to the hospital when I wasn't there to check on her condition? What good would it do for an amateur like me to go? It's better to leave illness and injury to the doctors. That's not what I'm talking about. As a human being, as a father, didn't you feel worried? I understand there are people who don't develop maternal or paternal instincts even after becoming parents, who can't embrace those feelings at all. But how can someone not even worry as a human being? Was his dedication to volunteer work just for show? I was more disappointed in his lack of basic human emotion than his lack of paternal instinct. I'm sorry, but I don't think I can continue with you anymore. Let's get divorced. Divorce? Isn't that extreme? Over something so minor. Besides, it's because our daughter put it in her mouth on her own, isn't it? It's because you haven't disciplined her properly. I too would love to spend more time with our daughter if I could, to teach her things slowly and carefully. Besides, it should be several times easier for adults to be careful than to discipline a young child. I wanted to say it was because he wouldn't step up, because his earnings were poor. But something told me I shouldn't say that. While I was struggling with how to convince him, feeling confused, my father-in-law, who had been silently observing our conversation, finally spoke up. Get a hold of yourself. The root cause is your lack of endurance. As it turned out, my husband had initially worked at a better-paying company but had quit and taken his current job after giving up on the intense workload. His current company had no overtime, no business trips, no transfers, and no weekend work. He had chosen this company wanting to use his time meaningfully, even if the salary wouldn't increase over the years. My in-laws said they had wondered how any woman would agree to marry him with such an income. These days, they said, it's outdated to think the husband must be the primary breadwinner. It's fine for the higher earner to work while the other handles household duties. They thought we had married with this understanding. This is what happens when a half-baked man tries to put on airs. Marriage means taking responsibility for another person's life. If you're not ready for that, you have no right to have a family. Apparently, having been strictly disciplined by his father, my husband couldn't argue back against his father's intensity. When told he needed to have his character reformed, my husband mumbled, "I want a divorce." It seems he had trauma from his father's strict swimming lessons in childhood, becoming hyperventilative just seeing a pool. He started crying out that he'd rather divorce than experience that nightmare again. Thanks to his father's pressure, we were able to divorce smoothly. Sometime after the divorce, my ex-husband contacted me. During the divorce, we had agreed that child support would be paid monthly until our daughter turned 20, rather than as a lump sum. My in-laws were strictly monitoring the payments, so there hadn't been any delays so far. When I got his call, I thought he might be struggling with payments and wanting to discuss that. Actually, some colleagues saw me getting lectured by my father. It had become quite a dramatic scene at his workplace. Feeling humiliated by his father, he had confided in a colleague who had witnessed it, saying, "Everyone made such a big fuss over nothing." He had revealed everything he had done to our daughter. He had also said, "I was just watching the kid as my wife asked, but got yelled at. Talk about unfair." True, I had asked him to watch our daughter and make sure she didn't fall or bump into things. But that didn't mean just literally watching her, though that's how he had apparently explained it. But this backfired. His sensible colleagues told him, "You're the worst." That's like saying you were asked to watch a bag but didn't chase the thief because you weren't specifically told to recover it if stolen. You're just being deliberately difficult. What are you, a child? Moreover, my husband had spoken loudly in the company cafeteria, so surrounding employees had overheard everything. Employees who heard called him inconsiderate, and when his supervisor heard the rumors, he was called in and lectured. What did you learn from all that volunteer work? Now he was being viewed coldly at work, making it uncomfortable to be there. It was affecting his work, and at this rate, he wouldn't be able to pay child support. He begged me to explain to everyone that he wasn't wrong, that others had just overreacted. He hadn't reflected at all. He had only agreed to the divorce and child support because he didn't want his father angry with him. There's a possibility he had only married me seeing me as an easy target for a comfortable life. After all, while not completely, I had supported the majority of our married life. You know, you've never once apologized to me or our daughter, have you? Of course, I don't remember ever being thanked either. Why should I listen to your request? I agreed to the divorce and child support, didn't I? What more do you want from me? Come on, isn't it your turn to listen to my request? I've been yelled at plenty by my father because of you. Listening to my husband's nonsensical arguments was giving me a headache. I told him never to call me again except about child support and hung up. But he immediately called back, persistently begging, please. It was so annoying that I told him my father-in-law was here visiting, which finally silenced his pestering calls. Some time later, I heard from my in-laws that my ex-husband had quit his job, unable to face his colleagues. Without any technical skills, he could only find work at an even lower-paying company. He asked his parents for financial help, but his father flatly refused. When his mother suggested he could save on rent by living at home, he said he'd do anything except live with his father, so he's somehow managing on his low income. But things obviously got tough, and he contacted me again. He said the child support payments were becoming too much of a burden and asked to reduce the amount. Paying money for your daughter is the least you can do. If you really want to reduce the amount, let's talk through lawyers. I won't agree to any reduction, even if it goes to court. When I added that I would also take legal action to collect payments if they stopped, he said paying child support was better than paying lawyer fees, and for now, the agreed amount continues to be deposited on schedule. I moved back to my parents' home and am balancing work and childcare with their help. My father says he can still work and has been re-employed 3 days a week at his former company. Meanwhile, my mother quit her job for my sake. Though I felt guilty since she loved her work, she told me not to worry, saying this was what she wanted to do, things she couldn't do for me before, and that it was just for her own satisfaction. She's always there so neither our daughter nor I feel lonely. When I come home, someone is always waiting for me. Seeing the lights on in the house gives me such comfort. The family life I dreamed of is now right before my eyes. Being able to return to my parents' home where I can confidently leave our daughter has allowed me to focus even more on my work. Though my commute increased after moving back home, I was eventually transferred to a branch office near my parents' house. I still keep in touch with my in-laws. We have video calls and share videos of our daughter, all watching over her growth together.